and the Republican side of the aisle to acknowledge the mathematical problem.
I know you're reading your talking points. When I interview, hang on, I'm going to answer your question. When I interview,
I think they had ideas, but they were bad ideas. They were bad ideas for America.
Senator, we're a little off topic. I have to let Senator Obama respond to that
because that just
I'll
doesn't.
tell you what the facts are.
Rick, again.
You had the word.
I'm speaking.
I'm
speaking.
The newspaper.
I'm speaking.
Welcome to UCTV Politics. I'm your moderator, Rebeecca Greenberg. Tonight I'm joined by Bennett Cognato, who is arguing the Democratic side, and Cameron Wilcox, who is arguing for the Republican side. This debate will focus on campaign finance reform. By virtue of a pre-debate coin toss, Bennett will start with his opening statement, followed by Cameron.
Thanks very much, Becca and UCTV, for having me here, as well as everyone who's watching along on their computers. So when we talk about campaign finance, unfortunately, we live in an America today where millionaires and billionaires are encouraged and able to spend millions and billions of dollars on influencing elections. And what we talk about when we talk about influencing elections is really buying politicians to vote in favor of whatever interests it is that those donors decide. So along with this heavy deregulation of campaign finance and tax breaks for the wealthy, we see a really stifling of democracy for the average voter. I think what we've got to turn towards is a Supreme Court that embraces democracy instead of big campaign donations, as well as a public finance system that provides for the average voter to be heard more than the average billionaire.
Thank you, Bennett. Cameron?
Well, when it comes to campaign finance, more today than ever, it's a matter of freedom and the expression of First Amendment rights by the citizens of this country. And it's important that they be protected, and we make sure that in all scenarios, people are able to donate as much as they would want to a candidate. Now, when it comes to disclosure and being able to see it, I think it's very important that there's full disclosure. You should be able to know who's donating and how much. But we also need to make sure that these people that are willing to donate and participate in our political process are protected, and that they don't have to worry about backlash for the donations and what they support. But overall, I think that it's also important that we educate the country on this subject, and that we make sure that everyone does have an equal say by limiting the influence of things that don't accurately represent what this country believes in or the people that live in it, such as labor unions and other organizations such as that, with donating to campaigns.
Thank you. Now the first question is for Bennett. Since the McCain-Feingold Act was ruled unconstitutional in 2010, corporations and unions are now once again allowed to support candidates for elections. What effects has this ruling had on campaigning, specifically in this election season, and do you agree with it?
Well, I don't agree with the overturning of the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Neither do I agree with the Citizens United decision, which saw a lot of our sort of campaign finance regulations overturned. But I do want to go back to something that Cameron said before about freedom and labor unions. And I think when we talk about labor unions, being able to buy into the system of donating to political candidates is a much different system than we see applying to big corporations and things like that. So when it comes to campaign finance and protection from the average voter from these big corporate lobbying, it comes down to protection against private healthcare costs, pharmaceutical companies, big oil costs. So we've really got to rein that system in. It can't be dominated by big corporate donations to campaigns.
Cameron?
Well, I think that it's important to note when you got to look at the facts. The public sees it. All they hear about with the media and the way it goes is these big corporations they're strangling the process, and they're making sure that no one has a vote. But when you look at it, 11 out of the 14 biggest spenders in the last election were labor unions, and everyone goes, oh, all right, that makes sense because labor unions represent the workers. Less than 15% of the working class in America is represented by labor unions. So when you want to talk about corporations diluting the voting power of the people, 11 out of the 14 biggest spenders that you have out there are these labor unions that represent less than 15%. That sounds a lot to me like what corporations are being accused of being done by Bennett.
Well, I'd love to see a source on that labor union stat. When it comes down to it, I mean, the Koch brothers are the ones donating some $750 million to this year's presidential cycle alone. So when you look at these big companies donating to these candidates, I've got to think that they're not just doing it because they want to, exercise their civil duty. They're doing it because they expect to get something from that donation, and I think that's an issue.
All right. Thank you. Cameron, this question is for you. This presidential campaign season has addressed campaign finance reform in many recent debates. Hillary Clinton has publicly accepted financial backing from huge companies like Goldman Sachs, while Bernie Sanders often speaks about his donation-funded campaign. Do you think that large corporations have too great an influence on elections?
Well, when it comes to elections and the way that corporations donate to them, do I think that the corporations have a right to voice their views and to use the money that they have to do so? Yes, because like I said earlier, it's a First Amendment right, and the way they're recognized in the legal system should allow it. However, I do think that it's very important that states institute incentives to get the everyday person to donate money. If we don't want, including labor unions, if we don't want these large corporations, large labor unions, if the consensus is that they shouldn't have so much power, it's important to institute programs that would, for example, cover your first $500 donated. If everyday people could get involved in the system by donating $500 and have it as a tax break, you would see a lot more people get involved. And if that money is donated, it takes a lot of power away from the large groups such as labor unions that would have power over it. It brings the power back to the people, and I think that is an important step.
Well, I think when we talk specifically about the power of big corporations, what it has to do with is their ability to donate from the general funds of their business, as opposed to donating as individuals and having that individual limit on their contributions. When corporations can donate from their general fund to candidates, I think it says that we're accepting that corporations are people that have ideas and values, and I just don't think that makes any sense versus the individual sovereignty of voters making their choices individually versus influenced by big money.
I think I understand the point, saying that the corporations don't represent the everyday interests of people, but I mean, at the same time, when you look at it, they have the First Amendment right to donate and to support their views. They have shareholders who do represent the American people because they are themselves successful American people, and they want their money used to donate. We see these, it gets information out. It's a nice way to donate and use their ability to do it. I think if everyone wants to donate, the fact is that people don't get very involved in the political system. And I think that when you have groups that are misrepresenting them, such as labor unions and things like that, it just makes it difficult, but that they should be allowed to donate and use their First Amendment right.
All right, we're going to take a quick commercial break, but stay tuned for more UCTV Politics after this. Welcome back to UCTV Politics. And now, Bennett, this question is for you. In the 2010 ruling, the limit on the amount of money one could donate to a campaign was lifted because the act is believed to be in violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, specifically free speech. Do you believe that by limiting the amount of money a candidate can spend, the type of message he or she sends out is stifled?
I think when you talk about the kind of money that someone sends out to represent their political views, I think you have to acknowledge that when we live in a country where 99% of all new income goes to the top 1%, that it's that 1% that really has all that influence and all that voice. So when we talk about, and Cameron talks about a freedom of speech for all people to be able to express their sort of political views and support for candidates, I think the best way to do that is to move towards a public system versus continually deregulating the amounts that wealthy people and big corporations can pour into politics. I think if you have a system where the average voter receives a $100 tax credit or a $100 voucher to donate to whoever they choose, that's a much more fair system that promotes much more freedom of speech than a system where it's ultimately ruled by the billionaire class.
Cameron?
Well, I think that when it comes to this situation, I think first it's important to note that both parties, both sides of the aisle, don't want to limit it. Certain sides might say they want to, but with the budget that passed in 2015, before it was passed, both Democrats and Republicans inserted a rider into the bill that raised the amount that national parties could have donated to them, and both sides supported it, and it was passed. So I think that both parties, maybe under the radar, don't have a problem with the amount of money because they know it's going to continue to go up. As far as recent races, if you look at the race in Massachusetts between Brown and Warren,
Brown, the Republican, wanted a race with no outside funding, and Warren was the one that said no. So it really goes to both sides. But I think the most important thing is that if you can't stop the flow of money, which it's extremely hard to do and it's an extremely slow process, you need to institute, like what I said earlier with the tax credit reforms. Right now, about 10,000 people per district donate funds, and if we were to institute tax credits to reimburse the people for their first donations, the numbers statistically, sources have been pointing to 25,000 people per district, which is a huge increase and an important way to get people more involved.
Bennett?
Sure. So I think going back to what you were saying about the Democrats versus Republican taking corporate contributions and things like that from wealthy individuals is certainly valid. I think there is definitely a bit of a split in the Democratic Party right now. We saw them sort of rolling back some of the restrictions that President Obama put in place after he was elected in 2008. So I think there's a little bit more of a split between, former Secretary of State Clinton and Senator Bernie Sanders. But we certainly are leaning both, I think, towards this idea of having a tax voucher, some sort of program that encourages more of that individual participation. But I think if that's going to be successful, it has to go hand in hand with restricting the access of wealthy donors to the political system in America.
All right. Cameron?
Well, I would just...
Actually, we're on to the next question.
Slightly upsetting. Here we go.
No problem. So according to the Moritz College of Law, social welfare organizations are non-profit, tax-exempt organizations in which their primary purpose is engaging in social welfare activities. These organizations are not required to disclose their donors. Should nonprofits be allowed to participate in campaigns without the public knowing who is behind them and how much money is being contributed?
Well, when it comes to disclosure, I think it's important to note that there have been many Republicans in support of full disclosure, as am I. When it comes to, you have John McCain, Mitch McConnell, even John Boehner has been quoted as saying that, various quotes saying that full disclosure is necessary and should happen. I believe that when it comes to the political arena, all groups should be required to reveal how much they donated, what they donated to. I think holding people accountable for what they donate for is an important part, especially if you're protecting the First Amendment right to have the free speech and to donate as much as you want, then there should be no problem to allowing people to see what was donated. I do think it's important that we institute measures to prevent people from backlash because multiple people have donated in the past few election cycles on both sides of the aisle, and they've received backlash from their places of employment. There are multiple people fired because they donated to causes that were frowned upon by their workplace organization, and that's where you're also seeing their First Amendment rights not be protected. I think it's an important lapse in the legal system right now to prevent people from participating.
Bennett?
Sure. Well, I agree. I'm surprised to see Cameron, I think, walking a little bit on the side of reform here instead of, sort of the Republican deregulation that we saw, especially through the 2000s and earlier than that, led by Mitch McConnell and George Bush administration and all that. What we see currently is a system that is set up so that the donors of super PACs don't have to be identified. So as much as we talk about wanting transparency, that's really just not how it works right now, and that's certainly something that we're pushing for, but I think that's really only coming mostly from the Democratic side at this point.
Cameron?
Well, I think, let's make sure we're not misinterpreting me here. As far as disclosure, full disclosure important because it allows people to exercise their First Amendment rights more. I don't know about you, but if I see somebody out there donating $200 to something that's clearly against my views, I might go donate $300. It increases participation, but it allows you should still be able to spend as much money as you would like to support your candidates, as all groups should be able to. I think that that's important. Disclosure allows you to see what your options are and just who's on your side, but we shouldn't use the disclosure aspect of this to limit how much people can donate and support their ideals.
All right, it's time for another quick break, but we still have much more ahead on UCTV Politics, so stay tuned.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. You look bored. You look like you need a homework break. Do you know what's going on at UConn? Do you want to be entertained? Then go to the UCTV Channel 14 at youtube.com. youtube.com/the UCTV Channel 14. You're welcome.
Welcome back. All right, this time Cameron is up first. Would you support efforts to reform the campaign finance system? And do you think reform would help bring the public further into the political process?
Oh, I definitely think that reform's needed in terms of disclosure. Do I think reform's needed as far as limiting the amount of money you can spend? No, I don't believe that should be instituted at all. I believe that the most important thing is actually expanding the process by the tax incentives we've both spoken about earlier, such as what Virginia has, where they cover the first $500 of a donation for people. If we can increase the amount that the everyday person donates and actually get them interested or active in the political process, it would change the system and it would bring power back to the people. In recent polls, the majority of American citizens rated campaign finance reform in the bottom 5 as should be a priority in any debate or general election format. I think it's important to get people's attention onto this topic and show them how important it is to get disclosure and to get more involved personally to donate into the process. I think that's very important and should be brought up a lot more than it currently is.
Bennett.
Sure. So just digging into that, I think there's a variety of reasons you can see as to why people aren't choosing to get more involved with the political process, especially when that process has so much to do with money and resources and how much you can afford to give to a candidate. So, when you've got plenty of workers making $7.25 an hour, I'm not so sure that they're thinking about how much they're going to give or even to who that they're going to give it. Like I talked about before, when you see wealth being so concentrated amongst the elite in this country, I think it's perfectly reasonable to see how that money is only being spent by those elite and not by the average citizen getting involved in politics.
I think that's the point of the tax incentives. Obviously, you don't expect everyone to have the money. Rarely do I have $500 lying around to donate to a political candidate. I don't know about you. So if that's the tax incentive, which covers it for you so that you do have that ability to donate. And if you don't have the time or the money to donate, but you have the time to vote, then you obviously have polarity towards a candidate. And if you have the ability to donate through these tax incentives, then you should do so. Because if more money is put into the system by the everyday people, it reduces the power without limiting and restricting the First Amendment rights of everybody. I think that's the most important part. Don't restrict rights and get more people involved. Involvement in education is the solution here, not restricting
Bennett?
the amendments granted by the Constitution.
Sure. You can have plenty of people donating their $5 or whatever it is they're going to be able to afford on a, one of the most suppressed worker wages that we've had since, over the last 50 years. But comparing that again to the $750 million that the Koch brothers are going to donate this election cycle, it just does not match up. So you can talk about transparency, you can talk about tax credits for those who aren't able to afford the big contribution amounts, but those contribution amounts are millions of dollars that are just not matchable by the average citizen. Or labor unions, either, by the way.
Well, I think that's very important that you noted that, because you like to make it out as if it's corporations versus the small everyday person, when the Democrats do have those labor unions which misrepresent the people in the working class of America quite thoroughly, donating very large amounts of money to campaigns as they go along. So I think it's an important thing to note that it's not a one-sided affair with the people struggling underneath the wrath of corporations.
Sure. Well, I can see how you would be against the political involvement of labor unions when those labor unions are the ones fighting for a living wage for workers and worker protections.
They represent less than 15% of the working class, and you're going to sit here and tell me that having them have all the power in politics would be the right way to represent the working class? Because having 85% underrepresented seems like something you would want to fix.
Well, it's not so much about the labor unions representing too much. It's about the labor unions representing the average worker.
We actually have to end this question. We'll move on to our last question of the night. This goes to you, Bennett. Should political advertisers be required to identify the top sponsors behind all ads appearing on all forms of mass media?
Sure. I think that's a tricky question because everything else about the sort of campaign finance landscape right now is so deregulated. So even when we require super PACs to list donors or campaigns to list who's funding things, you'll get, sort of rhetorical not true names of these super PACs and things like that, that we really, even though they're required to have a name, will sort of hide the real interest behind, you know, the money and things like that. So I think it requires a much larger approach to reining in money than just focusing on ads.
Cameron?
I actually do think it's important too. I think when you look at the age that we live in with the social media, the quick internet access, very rarely do people take the time to delve deeper than, say, a viral video or campaign ad. And when you see the names at the end, they are misleading, and a lot of people automatically associate that with the candidate that it seems to be against the person the ad's about. And I think when you do that, it's misleading against all the candidates. It's misleading to not know who exactly is putting the words online, who exactly is giving you the information. So I think it's just another way to educate the people, which helps them get more involved.
Bennett?
Sure, no, I agree. I think that the more we're able to make these disclosures, the more we're able to be clear about who it is behind the big donations, then the better the system works as a whole.
I too agree with that, as long as it's understood that when you're doing these donations, as long as your name's revealed and that people can see who's accountable, if you're being held accountable for your actions, there should be no limit to how much you can express your views and how much you can help voice your ideals and push them forward. That's the beauty of the system.
Well then, I mean, if you look at that in terms of an extreme, if there's a certain person with, for all intents and purposes, an unlimited amount of money that's allowed to pour and their unlimited amount of money into the political system, I don't think there's any restraints against the weight that that person can have in deciding the leaders of the country, our foreign policy, our drug prices, and I think that all of those things, when they're controlled by the wealthy elite, negatively affect the average person who isn't able to make the same kind of pull through donations.
Now our debaters are going to give us their closing statements. Because Bennett started off with the opening statements, we will start with Cameron for the closing.
Well, when it comes to campaign finance, it's just another example of how, in today's time, it's important to protect the Constitution, to protect the amendments that this country has been so graciously awarded over time, and that we need to protect the First Amendment by allowing and making sure that everyone is able to donate and voice their ideals and protect their interests as much as they can. As far as disclosure goes, I think it's important that we make sure there's full disclosure and accountability for all those parties involved if you're willing to get into the political arena and donate. I also think that it's extremely important that we continue to educate the public to get them more involved, and that we make sure that there are things such as tax incentives and other sorts of programs and proposals to allow people to be able to donate without feeling the strain monetarily of not being able to participate, or maybe they'll feel more eager to participate if they know that they can contribute more. So I think that's important. I would like to thank you to everybody for having us on here tonight. Great job moderating, great job debating, and God bless America.
Bennett?
Sure. So when we talk about this right to donate and this right to have a stake in an election, I think it's important to talk about the right to vote, right, and the right to participate in civil society. And I think when you have as much campaign finance deregulation as we've had in the United States, when you have as much corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the wealthy in this country, that it's easy to see that wealth is sort of concentrated into this wealthy elite that then also has, you know, the most freedom to spend that money into the political process to influence elections. So what we got is candidates that are willing to represent the interests of big corporations and wealthy donors, and it undermines the voice of the average citizen. So what I think we've got to do is move towards a more public model. I believe that that public model is within the future steps of the Democratic Party. So I would encourage all our viewers to get involved in the Connecticut primaries coming up, as well as the election in November. And I also want to thank UCTV for having me as well. It was a great debate.
Well, that's all for us tonight on this episode of UCTV Politics. Be sure to tune in this coming Thursday for a special live edition of UCTV Politics on the topic of gun control. That'll be one you don't want to miss. From all of us here at UCTV, good night.